Marital influence. When choosing a life mate, men and women should carefully consider whether that person is committed to walking in the will of God. Here's Gene.
You say, where do we get that from 2 Kings? Well, look at this text, 2 Kings 8, verses 16 and following. We have Judah's king Jehoram. In the 5th year of Israel's king Joram, son of Ahab, Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, became king of Judah, replacing his father. And you have to realize now that in the list of the kings of Judah and the list of the kings of Israel, you have names that are interchangeable. These were Hebrew names. In fact, Jehoram and Joram are used right here, and sometimes the Joram is called Jehoram, and Jehoram is called Joram, even within one list of kings, and then you have the mix between Judah and Israel, so it can become very confusing. But if you look carefully, you can ferret it out, particularly if you take a list of the kings of Israel, which you can get in good commentaries, a list of the kings of Israel, Judah, and you can compare all this. So here we have this young man, and it's the king of Judah, not the king of Israel, the king of Judah, because, of course, the kingdoms are divided at this point, and they were divided because of Solomon's sin. And you had the two divisions. You had Judah, and then you had Israel. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. Now, that gives you a clue. We're talking about Judah because it's the capital city is Jerusalem. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He didn't follow David, his forefathers. He followed the kings of Israel, the evil kings. And remember, out of 19 kings in Israel, there wasn't one good king. They were all bad. And here's the king of Judah is being impacted by the kings of Israel. And why was that true? Well, he walked in the way of the kings of Israel as the house of Ahab had done for Ahab's daughter. Ahab's daughter. Her name was Athaliah. We'll meet her later. She was evil. For Ahab's daughter was his wife, and he did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Now, you need to understand that Athaliah was the daughter of whom? Jezebel. Does that make sense in terms of her behavior? Well, you see, we see Jezebel's influence, for example, on Ahab. Ahab was the king of Israel, and we read in 1 Kings, going back to 1 Kings, chapter 21, verse 25, still there was no one like Ahab who devoted himself to do what was evil in the Lord's sight. Why? What's the connection? Because his wife Jezebel incited him. Now, it doesn't mean Ahab wasn't responsible for his behavior, but Jezebel was an incredible pagan, an idolater, a Gentile, a pagan, and devoted to horrible evil. And so she was able to wrap Ahab around her finger. She manipulated him. She controlled him. It's an incredible story. But basically, what you have here, see, is Athaliah, the daughter of Jezebel, having influence now on Joram, who's the king of Judah. So you see that incredible impact. There's a principle that really comes out of this. We looked at this in 1 Kings, principle 37, and it's called evil influences. We can generalize this, obviously, beyond marriage and family. We are to avoid close fellowship with people who persist in living evil lives. And that's a very important principle. That's a generalization, but Paul picks up on this in the New Testament. And he becomes very specific in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And the Corinthians were pagans, and many of them were continued to live a pagan lifestyle even after they became believers. And Paul had to address that. And what he said was, do not be mismatched with unbelievers. Now, what does he mean by unbelievers here? Well, he gets very specific. For what partnership is there between righteousness and lawlessness? This is black and white, good and evil. And the partnership is the kind of relationship that Ahab had with Jezebel. Partnering in evil. Horrible evil. And we see the same thing here with Joram and Athaliah. Partnering with evil schemes. Or what fellowship does light have with darkness? What agreement does Christ have with Belial, or with Satan, or with evil? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? And here he's spelling out very clearly the black and white situation between good and evil. And in this Old Testament setting, we see the influence of evil through a wife onto a very weak, sinful man to begin with, or sinful men, if we consider both Jezebel and Athaliah, on the kings of Israel. And so it's a very specific illustration which gives us a very significant principle that relates to a life mate. And if you take and relate that to the life mate, specifically the principle reads, when choosing a life mate, men and women should carefully consider whether that person is committed to walking in the will of God. Otherwise, there are going to be problems. The reflection response question is, in what ways can unsaved or carnal Christian mates today influence their spouses to walk out of the will of God? Well, the fact of the matter is that we're in this kind of partnership, in this kind of relationship together, there can be serious and even subtle but serious influences on our lives that can lead us astray. We can be manipulated, controlled, and evil is very powerful when it comes to that kind of close relationship. Another reason that this can happen is that we have little fellowship with fellow Christians. And when we don't have fellowship with other Christians within that situation, it can create serious problems in being able to walk in the will of God. So it's a very important principle. As I said, it's a generalization as well that we need to take to heart. But there's good news here. The good news is, for example, from the Apostle Peter, when he was dealing with the fact that there were people in the New Testament world that did become believers where the mate did not become a believer. For example, he addresses this problem with wives who became believers and their husbands were pagans. And this is good news in the midst of bad news, where he wrote, wives in the same way, I'm reading from 1 Peter chapter 3, wives in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that even if some disobey the Christian message, they may be won over without a message by the way their wives live. It is possible for a mate, a Christian mate, to live a godly life even in a pagan relationship. And that's certainly what was happening here in the Roman world. And what he goes on to say, when they observe your pure, reverent lives, your beauty should not consist of outward things like elaborate hairstyles and wearing of gold ornaments or fine clothes. And by the way, that describes Jezebel to a T. This is not talking about normal jewelry. It's not talking about a conservative use of cosmetics, appropriate uses of these things. It's talking about the kind of thing that Jezebel did, and we'll see later what that means in terms of her prostitution kind of mentality. Peter's saying that's not the thing that will ultimately win a man to Christ. What will ultimately win him to Christ is the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very valuable in God's eyes. Does that guarantee that an individual will come to Christ who doesn't know Christ in that relationship? No. But it's an impactful kind of principle that does apply in many situations. And we've seen that at work, particularly in our own situations in a pastor and churches and so forth. So, marital influence, it is important. We shouldn't try out the 1 Peter 3 principle here by disobeying God and then saying, well, God will help me to win him to Christ or win her to Christ. We shouldn't deliberately disobey God to see God try to work in our lives. That's setting ourselves up for a horrible situation. But God many times does penetrate through those situations that are beyond our control. And certainly what Peter's talking about is beyond our control. A pagan wife becoming a believer, her husband not becoming a believer. That's a reality. But it's also a reality even though we make mistakes. And that's the wonderful thing about the Lord and his grace. Even when we make mistakes, we can confess that and then begin to apply principles that God will honor. No guarantee, obviously, because God gives people a free will. But the fact is that God does work through these principles.